The universe was vast, cold, and unforgiving. Humanity had managed to survive in this endless expanse of stars, but it wasn't easy. Earth, once the cradle of life, was now called a death world by alien civilizations. It was a place where storms could rip apart cities, predators roamed freely, and diseases waited patiently for their next victim. But humans were stubborn creatures. They adapted, they endured, and most importantly, they survived. Rachel Dawson lived on a small outpost orbiting a dying star. The station was old, its metal walls rusted and groaning under the strain of decades of use. Rachel spent her days studying strange plants and animals brought back from distant planets. She was a biologist, someone who understood life in all its forms. Her work kept her busy, but she often found herself staring out at the endless blackness outside her window, wondering if humanity would ever truly belong among the stars. One evening, as she sat hunched over her microscope, an alarm blared through the station. Red lights flashed, casting eerie shadows across the room. Rachel stood up quickly, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. She grabbed her jacket and ran toward the control center, her boots clanging against the metal floor. When she arrived, the other scientists were already there, gathered around a large screen showing an incoming fleet of ships. These weren't human ships. Their sleek design and glowing engines marked them as alien. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Alien visitors were rare, and when they came, it was rarely good news. The lead ship sent a transmission, and moments later, a figure appeared on the screen. He was tall, taller than any human, with shimmering silver skin that reflected the light like liquid metal. His eyes glowed faintly blue, and his voice was deep and commanding. "I am General Kaelvorth," he said, "commander of the Zyran fleet. I request an audience with your leader." The scientists exchanged nervous glances. There was no leader here, just a handful of researchers trying to make sense of the universe. Finally, one of them stepped forward and stammered, We don't have a leader, but Rachel Dawson can speak for us." Rachel froze. Why her? She wasn't a diplomat or a soldier. She was just a scientist. Still, she nodded and walked closer to the screen. Taking a deep breath, she said, "General Vorth, my name is Rachel Dawson. What brings you to our outpost?" Kaelvorth's gaze seemed to pierce right through her. "Humanity interests me," he said simply. "Your species has proven itself resilient, surviving on what many consider an uninhabitable planet. I wish to test this resilience further." Before Rachel could respond, another figure stepped into view. This one was younger, dressed in ornate armor covered in intricate patterns. His presence was less intimidating than Kael's, but there was still something about him that made Rachel uneasy. "This is my son, Torin," Kael continued. "He will accompany you to Earth. If you can keep him alive for 1 year, it will prove humanity's worth." Rachel blinked, stunned. "Earth?" she repeated. "You want us to take him to Earth?" "Yes," Kael replied. "Your world is known for its dangers. My son will learn much from your people. And you will be responsible for his survival." The weight of his words hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. 1 year, on Earth, with an alien prince who looked like he'd never lifted a finger in his life. It sounded impossible. But before she could argue, Kael added, "Do not fail me, Rachel Dawson. Failure will mean war." The screen went dark, leaving Rachel and the others standing in silence. War. That single word hung heavy in the air. Humanity couldn't afford another conflict, not after barely surviving the last one. Slowly, Rachel turned to face her colleagues. "We don't have a choice," she said quietly. "I'll do it." A few hours later, Rachel stood on the landing pad, watching as Torin descended from a massive alien ship. He moved with an air of arrogance, his every step deliberate and measured. Up close, he was even more imposing. His armor gleamed in the dim light, and his sharp features gave him an almost regal appearance. "Are you the one they call Rachel Dawson?" Torin asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Rachel forced herself to nod. "Yes, and you must be Torin." Torin smirked. "Good. Then let's get this over with." His attitude grated on her nerves, but Rachel bit back her frustration. Arguing wouldn't help. Instead, She led him to her ship, a small vessel designed for research missions. As they boarded, Torin looked around with obvious distaste. "This is your mode of transportation? It's primitive." "It gets the job done," Rachel replied curtly. She didn't bother explaining how advanced the ship actually was compared to most human technology. Torin wouldn't appreciate it anyway. The journey to Earth took several days. During that time, Torin mostly ignored Rachel, choosing instead to stare out the window at the endless void of space. Occasionally, he would ask questions about Earth, about humans, about why they insisted on living in such a hostile environment. Rachel answered as best she could, though she sensed he wasn't really listening. Finally, they reached Earth. Rachel guided the ship to a remote area in the Pacific Northwest, far from prying eyes. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense and wild. Trees towered overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Birds chirped in the distance, and the smell of pine filled the air. "This is it," Rachel said as they stepped onto solid ground. "Welcome to Earth." Torin wrinkled his nose. "It smells organic." "That's because it is," Rachel said dryly. "Come on, we need to set up camp before nightfall." As they worked together to pitch tents and gather supplies, Rachel noticed something strange. For all his arrogance, Torin wasn't entirely useless. He followed instructions well enough, and when given a task, he completed it efficiently. Still, his dismissive attitude toward Earth irritated her. Every time he referred to the planet as primitive or barbaric, she wanted to snap at him, but she held her tongue. Arguing wouldn't change his mind. Besides, they had bigger problems to worry about. Earth was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous. Predators lurked in the shadows, and the weather could turn deadly without warning. Keeping Torin alive for a year wouldn't be easy, but Rachel was determined to try. Little did she know, their journey was only beginning. Over the coming months, both of them would face challenges that would test their strength, their resolve, and perhaps even their humanity. And somewhere along the way, they might just learn something about each other and themselves. The forest was alive with sound. Birds chirped in the trees, their calls blending with the rustling of leaves and the distant gurgle of a stream. It was peaceful, almost serene, but Rachel knew better than to let her guard down. Earth's beauty was deceptive. Beneath its tranquil surface lay countless dangers, some obvious, others hidden until it was too late. Rachel stood at the edge of their campsite, watching as Torin wandered aimlessly among the trees. His armor gleamed faintly in the sunlight, making him look out of place against the earthy tones of the forest. He didn't seem interested in helping set up camp or learning how to survive. Instead, he spent most of his time inspecting plants, poking at insects, and muttering to himself about how primitive everything was. "Torin," Rachel called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through his distracted musings. "Stay close. You don't know what's out here." He turned to face her, his expression one of mild annoyance. "I can take care of myself," he said dismissively. "Your world may be dangerous, but I'm not afraid." Rachel sighed inwardly. She'd heard this line before, usually followed by some reckless action that put them both in danger. Still, she decided to try reasoning with him again. "Look, I get it. You're used to being in control. But Earth isn't like your home. Things here don't play by the rules you expect. One wrong step, and you could end up hurt, or worse." Torin rolled his eyes but said nothing. He walked back toward the campsite, though not without casting a final glance over his shoulder at the forest. Rachel shook her head. Convincing him to take Earth seriously was going to be harder than she thought. The first few days passed uneventfully. They explored the area around the campsite, gathering firewood and testing the water from a nearby stream. Rachel taught Torin basic survival skills: how to start a fire, identify edible plants, and purify water. At first, he resisted, claiming he had no need for such barbaric methods. But when she refused to share her rations unless he helped, he reluctantly complied. Despite his complaints, Torin proved to be a quick learner. Once he stopped scoffing at every task, he picked up on things surprisingly fast. By the end of the week, he could build a decent fire and even identified a few medicinal herbs without prompting. Rachel couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, though she kept it to herself. Complimenting him might just inflate his already oversized ego. But progress came with setbacks. On the 4th day, while scouting for food, Torin stumbled into a patch of poison ivy. By the time he returned to camp, his arms were covered in angry red welts. He swore loudly, pacing back and forth as if movement would somehow make the itching stop. "You should have listened to me," Rachel said, trying and failing to hide her smirk. "I told you not to touch anything unfamiliar. This is ridiculous." Torin snapped, scratching furiously at his arms. "How do humans live with such irritants?" "It's part of the deal," Rachel replied, handing him a paste made from crushed plant leaves. "Rub this on affected areas. It'll help with the itching." Torin hesitated, eyeing the greenish goo suspiciously. "Are you sure this won't kill me?" "No, it won't kill you," Rachel said, rolling her eyes. "Just trust me, okay?" Reluctantly, Torin applied the paste. Within minutes, the itching subsided, and he grudgingly admitted that it worked. "Fine," he muttered. "Maybe you're not completely useless." Rachel chuckled under her breath. Baby steps. As the days turned into weeks, the challenges grew more intense. The weather shifted unpredictably, swinging from scorching heat to freezing rain overnight. Streams flooded, forcing them to relocate their camp twice. And then there were the animals. Wolves circling perimeter at night, bears rummaging through their supplies, and once a snake slithering dangerously close to where they slept. Through it all, Torin continued to adapt. He learned to read the signs of changing weather, track animal movements, and even fashion crude tools from sticks and stones. Though he still complained constantly, his complaint became less frequent and slightly less dramatic. One evening, as they sat around the fire eating roasted fish, Torin glanced at Rachel. "You humans are strange," he said after a long pause. "You live in constant danger, yet you act as though it's normal." "It is normal," Rachel replied, shrugging. "We don't have a choice. Earth doesn't hand us anything. We have to fight for everything we get." Torin frowned, staring into the flames. "I suppose that's why my father sent me here, to understand what it means to struggle." Rachel looked at him curiously. This was the first time he'd mentioned his father since arriving on Earth. "Do you think he expected you to fail?" she asked carefully. "I don't know," Torin admitted. "He never tells me what he expects, only that I must prove myself worthy." There was a bitterness in his tone that Rachel hadn't noticed before. For all his arrogance, Torin seemed burdened by expectations that weighed heavily on him. She wondered what it must be like living under the shadow of someone as powerful as Kael Vorth. Before she could respond, a loud crack echoed through the forest. Both of them froze, listening intently. Another crack, closer this time. Something, or someone was moving toward them. Rachel grabbed a torch and stood up slowly, motioning for Torin to stay behind her. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "And whatever happens, don't run." The bushes rustled violently, and then a massive elk burst into the clearing. Its antlers glinted in the firelight, and its eyes were wild with panic. It charged straight toward them, hooves pounding the ground like thunder. "Move!" Rachel shouted, diving to the side just as the elk barreled past. Torin wasn't as quick. He stumbled backward, tripping over a log and landing hard on the ground. The elk skidded to a halt, turning to face them. Its chest heaved as it snorted angrily, clearly agitated by their presence. Rachel scrambled to her feet, holding the torch high. "Don't move," she hissed at Torin. "Let it calm down." But Torin wasn't listening. Still lying on the ground, he reached for a rock and hurled it at the animal. The elk reared up, bellowing in rage, and charged again. "Torin, no!" Rachel yelled, stepping between him and the enraged creature. She swung the torch wildly, driving the elk back. It hesitated for a moment, then bolted into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rachel turned to Torin, her anger barely contained. "What were you thinking? That thing could have killed you." "I was defending myself." Torin shot back, climbing to his feet. "I wasn't just going to sit there and wait for it to trample me. There's a difference between defending yourself and provoking an attack." Rachel snapped. If you'd stayed calm, it would have left us alone. But no, you had to throw a rock at it. Torin opened his mouth to argue, but something in Rachel's expression stopped him. Her frustration was clear, but so was her fear. She hadn't been angry because he'd messed up. She'd been scared he'd gotten himself killed. Slowly, Torin's shoulders sagged. Fine, he muttered. I'll try to listen next time. Rachel exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. Good, because if you keep acting like this, I won't be able to protect you forever. That night, as they lay in their tent, Rachel found herself thinking about Torin. Despite his arrogance and impulsiveness, he was starting to grow on her. He wasn't perfect. In fact, he was far from it, but he was trying, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She drifted off to sleep with the sounds of the forest, lulling her into a restless slumber. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carried with it the promise of new challenges, and perhaps new beginnings. The sun rose slowly over the forest, casting long shadows across the ground. Rachel stirred in her tent, blinking away the remnants of sleep. She stretched and crawled outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The forest was quiet today, almost too quiet. It was the kind of calm that made her uneasy, like the world was holding its breath. Torin was already awake, sitting by the remains of last night's fire. He held a stick in his hand, poking at the ashes absent-mindedly. His expression was distant, as if he were lost in thought. For once, he didn't seem irritated or impatient. Instead, there was a strange softness in his eyes, a look Rachel hadn't seen before. Morning, she said, breaking the silence. Torin glanced up briefly, but didn't respond. He went back to staring into the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Rachel frowned. This wasn't like him. Normally, he'd be complaining about the cold or asking when they were leaving. Something was wrong. You okay? She asked, sitting down beside him. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how humans live in constant danger. Rachel nodded, waiting for him to continue. It's not just Earth, Torin said quietly. It's everywhere. Even on my planet, we face challenges, but we don't talk about them. We act like we're invincible, like nothing can touch us. Rachel tilted her head, surprised by his honesty. That sounds lonely. It is, he admitted, but it's also expected. My father, he doesn't show weakness. He expects the same from me. Rachel studied him carefully. Beneath his armor and arrogance, Torin was just a young man trying to live up to impossible standards. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, though she kept her tone light. Well, maybe Earth isn't such a bad place to learn how to let your guard down. Torin gave her a small, reluctant smile. Maybe. They packed up their campsite and set off toward higher ground. Rachel had mapped out a route that would take them through the mountains. She explained that the terrain would be rougher, but it offered better vantage points and fewer predators. Torin listened intently, nodding occasionally as if he understood the importance of planning ahead. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and colder. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and patches of snow. Every step required effort, and soon both of them were breathing heavily. Still, they pressed on, determined to reach the summit before nightfall. By midday, they stopped to rest near a small stream. Rachel knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. Torin joined her, splashing water onto his face. He looked pale, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to exhaustion. You doing all right? Rachel asked, watching him closely. I'm fine, Torin replied, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Just tired. Rachel frowned. They weren't even halfway up the mountain yet. If Torin couldn't keep up, they'd have to turn back. And she knew he wouldn't accept that. She handed him a piece of dried fruit. Eat this. You need energy. He took it without argument, chewing slowly. As he ate, Rachel scanned her surroundings. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched out below them, dotted with forests and rivers. But beauty aside, the landscape was treacherous. One wrong step could send them tumbling down the cliffs. We should keep moving, she said finally. The sooner we find shelter, the better. Torin nodded. Standing up, He winced slightly as he put weight on his right leg, but he didn't say anything. Rachel noticed, but decided not to push him. Pushing Torin usually ended badly. The climb became steeper as they moved higher. Loose gravel shifted underfoot, making every step precarious. Rachel led the way, testing each foothold before committing her full weight. Behind her, Torin followed, his movement slower than before. At one point, Rachel paused to check their progress. She turned to see Torin struggling to pull himself up a particularly steep section. His hand slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling down the slope. He swore under his breath, gripping the rock tightly. "Need a hand?" Rachel called out, reaching toward him. "I've got it," Torin snapped, his pride flaring despite his obvious distress. He managed to haul himself up, though his legs trembled with the effort. Once he was steady, he glared at her. "Don't treat me like I'm helpless." Rachel raised her hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to offend you, Your Highness." Torin scowled but said nothing. They continued climbing in tense silence, the only sounds their labored breathing and the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a valley. The wind whipped around them, biting at their skin. Rachel pointed to a cluster of boulders a short distance away. "We'll camp there tonight," she said. "It's sheltered enough to block the wind." Torin nodded, following her wordlessly. They set up camp quickly, using the boulders to shield themselves from the elements. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Rachel lit a small fire, feeding it twigs and dried moss until it crackled warmly. They sat close to flames, wrapped in blankets. Torin stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Rachel watched him, wondering what thoughts were running through his mind. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know, it's okay to admit when you're struggling," she said gently. "No one expects you to be perfect." Torin glanced at her, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "You do," he said after a moment. "Every time I make a mistake, you remind me how dangerous Earth is. How I need to be careful." "That's because it is dangerous," Rachel replied. "But that doesn't mean I expect you to be perfect. I just want you to stay alive." Torin looked away, his jaw tightening. "My father would never say that. He'd tell me to toughen up, to push through no matter what." "Well, I'm not your father," Rachel said firmly. "And I don't care about proving anything to anyone. All I care about is getting us through this year in one piece." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Torin let out a shaky sigh. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." Rachel smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The next morning, they resumed their journey. The path grew narrower and more treacherous, forcing them to move cautiously. At one point, Rachel spotted smoke rising from a distant ridge. She squinted, trying to make sense of it. Wildfires weren't common in this region, which meant the smoke was likely man-made. "Do you think there are other people nearby?" Torin asked, noticing her gaze. "Maybe," Rachel replied. "Could be hunters or hikers. Either way, we should avoid them. We can't risk anyone seeing you." Torin nodded, understanding the stakes. They adjusted their course, veering away from the source of smoke. As they descended into a rocky ravine, the ground began to shake subtly. At first, Rachel thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on her body. But then the tremors grew stronger, accompanied by a low rumbling sound. "Earthquake!" Rachel shouted, grabbing Torin's arm. "Get behind something solid." They scrambled toward a large boulder, pressing themselves against it as the ground split open. A fissure raced toward them, spewing steam and ash. The smell of sulfur filled the air, choking them as they tried to breathe. When the shaking finally subsided, Rachel peeked out from behind the boulder. The fissure had opened wide, revealing molten lava glowing ominously below. Heat radiated from the opening, making it hard to stand too close. "This way," Rachel said urgently, pulling Torin along. They needed to get off the ridge before another quake hit. But as they hurried forward, Torin slipped on loose gravel. He tumbled toward the edge of the fissure, his arms flailing as he tried to grab hold of something. Rachel lunged for him, catching his wrist just as he teetered over the abyss. Her muscles screamed as she strained to hold him. The heat from the lava seared her skin, but she refused to let go. "Grab my arm," she yelled, her voice hoarse with effort. Torin reached up, his fingers brushing hers. With one final burst of strength, Rachel yanked him back onto solid ground. They collapsed together, gasping for air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Torin looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. "You saved me," he whispered. Rachel shook her head, wincing as pain shot through her burned hands. "Don't mention it. Just don't scare me like that again." Torin didn't argue. Instead, he helped her to her feet, supporting her as they limped away from a fissure. Their bond had shifted somehow, forged in the crucible of danger and mutual vulnerability. As they found temporary shelter in a cave, Rachel realized something important. Despite everything, the arguments, the mistakes, the near-death experiences, she was starting to trust Torin. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to trust her too. The days that followed the earthquake were tense. Rachel's hands were bandaged, raw and blistered from the burns she'd suffered while saving Torin. The pain was constant, but she refused to slow down. They needed to keep moving. Earth wasn't forgiving, and neither were the people who might be watching. Torin had changed since the incident. He didn't complain as much anymore, and he seemed more aware of his surroundings. Whenever Rachel winced in pain or paused to catch her breath, he would step in without being asked. He carried supplies, gathered firewood, and even helped navigate their path through the rugged terrain. It was a small shift, but it spoke volumes about how far he'd come. Still, the weight of what had happened lingered between them. Neither of them talked about the earthquake or the moment when Rachel had risked her life to save him, but it hung in the air like an unspoken promise, a bond they couldn't ignore. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Torin finally broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. Rachel glanced at him, confused. "Do what?" "Save me," Torin said, staring into the flames. "You could have let go. It would have been easier." Rachel frowned, considering his words. She hadn't thought about it like that. In the heat of the moment, all she'd known was that she couldn't let him fall. Because it was the right thing to do, she replied simply, "I wasn't going to stand there and watch you die." "But why?" Torin pressed. "You barely know me. I've done nothing but insult you and question your abilities since we met. Why would you risk your life for someone like me?" Rachel sighed, leaning back against a tree trunk. "It's not about whether I like you or not," she said. "We're in this together, Torin. If I let you die, it wouldn't just be on you. It would be on me too. And besides," she hesitated, choosing her next words carefully, "you're not as bad as you pretend to be." Torin looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he nodded slowly, as if accepting her answer. "Thank you," he said quietly. Rachel smiled faintly. "Don't mention it." The next morning, they packed up camp and continued their journey. Their destination was unclear. They were simply trying to stay ahead of the dangers Earth threw at them. The forest gave way to open plains, where tall grass swayed in the wind and the horizon stretched endlessly before them. The change in scenery brought a sense of relief, though Rachel remained cautious. Open spaces meant fewer places to hide, and visibility worked both ways. As they walked, Rachel noticed something strange. Tracks in the dirt, too large to belong to any animal native to the region. They weren't human either. Her heart sank as realization dawned. Someone, or something, was following them. "We need to move faster," she said, quickening her pace. "We're being tracked." Torin glanced behind them, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon strapped to his side. "Who is it?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, "but they're not friendly." They pushed themselves harder, jogging across the plains until exhaustion set in. By nightfall, they found shelter in a shallow cave. Rachel lit a small fire, keeping it low so the light wouldn't give away their position. Torin stood guard at the entrance, scanning the darkness for signs of movement. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Just as Rachel began to think they might have lost whoever was following them, a sound echoed through the night, a soft whirring noise, almost mechanical. She froze, her blood running cold. That wasn't an animal. It was technology, They're here, she whispered, grabbing her pack. We have to leave. Now! Torin nodded, already moving toward the back of the cave. Together, they slipped out into the night, sticking close to the shadows. The whirring grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in a language neither of them understood. Rachel's stomach churned with dread. Whoever these people were, they weren't looking to make friends. They ran until their legs burned, putting as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. When they finally stopped to rest, hidden in a dense thicket, Rachel turned to Torin. Do you recognize them? Are they from your planet? Torin shook his head. No, but I think I know who they are. My father has enemies, powerful ones. They must have followed us here. Rachel felt a surge of anger. So this is your fault? Your family drama dragged us into danger. It's not my fault. Torin snapped, his voice rising. I didn't ask for this. Keep your voice down. Rachel hissed, glancing around nervously. We can argue later. Right now, we need to figure out how to survive. Torin clenched his fist but said nothing. They huddled together in silence, listening for any sign of pursuit. After a while, Rachel spoke again, her tone softer this time. Look, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. This isn't your fault. But we're in this together. Okay? We'll get through it. Torin nodded reluctantly. Okay. The next day, they stumbled upon an abandoned barn tucked away in a valley. It was old and weathered, its roof sagging under years of neglect, but it offered some protection. They decided to hole up there for a while, regrouping and planning their next move. Rachel spent hours studying maps and trying to find a safe route out of the area. Torin, meanwhile, tinkered with his weapon, making adjustments and repairs. Despite their differences, they worked well together, each contributing in their own way. That night, as they sat in the dim light of the lantern, Rachel voiced a thought that had been nagging at her. What happens if they catch us? Torin looked up, his expression grim. They'll kill me and take you hostage. They'll use you to force my father into submission. Rachel swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. Then we can't let them catch us. No, Torin agreed. We can't. Their reprieve was short-lived. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, the barn was surrounded. Armed figures emerged from the trees, their weapons trained on Rachel and Torin. There was no escape. Drop your weapons, one of them barked, stepping forward. His armor bore markings unfamiliar to Rachel, but Torin recognized him immediately. You're with the Krylos faction, he spat, his voice filled with venom. Traitors. The leader smirked. And you're the spoiled prince sent to play soldier. How disappointing. Rachel stepped in front of Torin, shielding him with her body. Take me, she said firmly. Leave him alone. The leader laughed, a cruel sound that sent chills down her spine. Brave words for a Deathworlder. But no, we'll take both of you. Before anyone could react, Torin shoved Rachel aside and lunged at the nearest attacker. Chaos erupted as weapons fired and shouts filled the air. Rachel scrambled to her feet, grabbing a piece of broken wood to defend herself. She fought desperately, driven by adrenaline and fear. In the end, it wasn't enough. Outnumbered and outgunned, they were overpowered. Rachel was knocked unconscious, her last memory the sight of Torin being dragged away. When she woke, she was tied to a chair in a makeshift camp. Her head throbbed, and her body ached from the fight. Across from her, Torin was bound to another chair, his face bruised and bloody. His eyes met hers, filled with guilt and regret. I'm sorry, he muttered. This is my fault. Rachel shook her head, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. No, it's not. We'll get out of this. Together. The leader of the Krylos faction approached them, his smile cold and calculating. Such loyalty, he sneered. How touching. But don't worry, you won't be apart for long. Once we deliver your bodies to General Vorth, he'll have no choice but to surrender. Torin struggled against his bonds, his voice fierce. My father will never bow to scum like you. The leader chuckled, raising a weapon. We'll see about that. Before he could act, Rachel kicked over a nearby lantern, igniting a small fire. Panic spread among the captors as flames licked at the dry grass. In confusion, Torin managed to break free, using the distraction to grab a weapon and cut Rachel loose. "Run!" he shouted, firing at their attackers. Rachel didn't hesitate. They sprinted into the woods, dodging bullets and shouting orders. The forest became a blur of green and brown as they fled for their lives. Behind them, explosions rocked the camp, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. Finally, they reached a clearing, collapsing onto the ground in exhaustion. Rachel coughed, her lungs burning from the smoke. "Did we lose them?" she gasped. "For now," Torin replied, his voice strained. "But they'll come after us again." Rachel nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they'd have to face their enemies head-on. And when that time came, she knew they'd need more than luck to survive. As they caught their breath, Torin placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not giving up on me." Rachel smiled weakly. "Like I said before, we're in this together." Little did they know, the worst was yet to come. The Krylos faction wasn't just hunting them. They were planning something far more sinister. And Torin's decision to protect Rachel would soon lead to a sacrifice neither of them could have foreseen. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against Rachel's ears like a weight. She and Torin moved quickly, their footsteps soft but urgent as they pushed deeper into the trees. The adrenaline from their escape had faded, leaving behind only exhaustion and fear. Every rustle of leaves or distant bird call made them flinch, their nerves stretched thin. Torin glanced over his shoulder constantly, his grip tightening on the weapon he'd taken from the Krylos camp. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "They won't stop until they finish what they started." Rachel nodded, her mind racing. "We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look." But where? Earth was vast, but it wasn't infinite. The Krylos faction had resources, ships, weapons, soldiers, and they clearly knew how to track their prey. Hiding wouldn't be enough. They needed a plan, something bold enough to turn the tables. As they trudged through the underbrush, Rachel spotted an old bunker half hidden by vines and moss. It looked abandoned, its metal door rusted and warped with age. She motioned for Torin to follow her inside. The air inside was damp and stale, but offered shelter for now. "This will have to do," Rachel said, brushing dust off a crumbling table. "We can rest here for a bit and figure out our next move." Torin leaned against the wall, his expression grim. "What's the point? Even if we survive this, my father will see me as a failure. I couldn't protect you. I couldn't even protect myself." Rachel turned to face him, her tone firm. "Stop that. You're not a failure, Torin. You saved me back there. If you hadn't acted when you did, neither of us would be alive right now. But at what cost?" Torin snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I dragged you into this mess. I put your life in danger. And for what? To prove I'm worthy? What does that even mean?" Rachel stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "It means doing the right thing, even when it's hard. It means standing up for what you believe in, no matter the odds. That's what makes someone worthy, not perfection, but effort. Not strength, but courage." Torin stared at her, his anger softening into something else. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. He didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Hours passed as they rested and planned. Rachel scavenged supplies from the bunker. A few cans of food, some tools, and a map of the surrounding area. Torin kept watch, pacing restlessly near the entrance. Neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "We can't keep running forever. We need to end this." "How?" Torin asked, turning to face her. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. They'll kill us before we even get close." "Not if we hit them where it hurts," Rachel replied. "Their ship. If we destroy it, they'll lose their advantage." Torin frowned. "That's suicide. Even if we manage to sneak aboard, there's no guarantee we'll make out alive." "I know," Rachel said simply, "but it's our best shot. Do you trust me?" Torin hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Under the cover of darkness, they made their way toward the Krylos base. The ship loomed ahead, its sleek design stark against the night sky. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and precise. Rachel and Torin crouched in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Stay close," Rachel whispered, pulling a small knife from her belt. "And don't hesitate. One wrong move and we're dead." Torin nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. They moved silently, slipping past guards and scaling the side of the ship. The hatch was locked, but Rachel managed to pry it open with a crowbar she brought from the bunker. They slipped inside, their hearts pounding as they navigated the narrow corridors. The interior of the ship was cold and sterile, the hum of machinery echoing around them. Rachel led the way, her instincts guiding her toward the engine room. If they could sabotage the core, the entire ship would go down. They reached the engine room without incident, but their luck ran out as soon as they entered. A group of Krylos soldiers was already there, guarding the reactor. One of them spotted them immediately, raising the alarm. "Intruders!" he shouted, firing his weapon. Rachel dug behind a console, returning fire with a makeshift gun Torin had modified earlier. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. Torin joined the fight, his aim steady despite the chaos. "Cover me!" Rachel yelled, sprinting toward the reactor. She planted explosives along the core, her hands trembling as she worked. The countdown began, ticking away the seconds until detonation. "Let's go!" she shouted, grabbing Torin's arm. But Torin didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the soldiers advancing toward them. Then, without warning, he charged forward, drawing their fire away from Rachel. "No!" Rachel screamed, trying to pull him back. But Torin shook her off, his expression resolute. "Get out of here," he ordered, his voice firm. "Finish this." Rachel hesitated, tears blurring her vision. She wanted to argue, to drag him away, but she knew it was useless. Torin had made his choice. With a final glance at him, she turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted toward the exit. Behind her, the sounds of gunfire grew louder, followed by a deafening explosion. The ship shuddered violently, throwing her to ground. When she finally staggered outside, the ship was engulfed in flames, its wreckage lighting up the night sky. Rachel collapsed to her knees, choking back sobs. Torin was gone. Days later, Rachel stood before General Kale Vorth aboard his flagship. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. In her hands, she carried Torin's broken armor and a small urn containing his ashes. Kale Vorth studied her silently, his glowing blue eyes unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with sorrow. "You failed." "No," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite her grief. "Your son didn't fail. He gave his life to save mine, to protect humanity. He proved himself worthy in ways you'll never understand." Kale's expression softened, just slightly. "Tell me what happened." Rachel recounted their journey, the challenges they faced, the bond they formed, and the betrayal that led to Torin's death. She held nothing back, letting her words paint a picture of a young man who had grown stronger, braver, and more compassionate than anyone had expected. When she finished, Kale rose from his throne and approached her. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the urn in her hands. Then, softly, he said, "My son was stubborn, reckless, and proud. But he was also brave. He chose to sacrifice himself for a cause greater than himself. That is something worth honoring." He placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You have my thanks, Rachel Dawson. Because of you, my son found purpose in his final days. And because of him, I will honor humanity's resilience." Rachel nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As Kale dismissed her, she left the ship with a mixture of emotions: grief for Torin, pride in what they had accomplished, and hope for the future. Earth remained a death world, harsh and unforgiving. But perhaps, just perhaps, it had taught everyone, including an alien general and his son, what it truly meant to be alive.